Rain tapped softly against the city, not hard enough to chase people indoors, but just enough to blur the streetlights into golden smears on the wet pavement. Most folks had already gone home, tucked into warm beds or gathered around kitchen tables. But not him. He walked alone, hands tucked deep in his coat pockets, collar turned up against the chill. The night air smelled like wet concrete and distant traffic. His mind was still buzzing from a long day of meetings, contracts, and numbers that never seemed to stop adding up. He'd made another deal today, another win. But somehow it didn't feel like winning. He wasn't used to walking like this. Usually a driver waited outside, engine idling, ready to take him wherever he needed to go. But tonight he'd told the car to leave. He needed space, needed to think without voices, screens, or expectations pressing in on him. So he wandered, letting his polished shoes splash through puddles he normally would have avoided. The park was nearly empty, just a few stragglers, a jogger with earbuds, a couple sharing an umbrella, but they disappeared quickly into the misty dark. He liked the quiet. The trees stood like silent guards, their leaves dripping softly. For a moment he forgot about quarterly reports and boardrooms. He just breathed. Then he saw them. Near the old playground, rusted swings, a slide with peeling paint, two small shapes huddled beneath a wooden bench. At first he thought they were kids playing hide-and-seek, maybe waiting for a parent. But something felt off. The way they stayed so still. The way their shoulders curled inward like they were trying to disappear. He slowed his steps. Didn't want to scare them. But as he got closer, the smaller one, a boy maybe 4 or 5, peeked out from under a thin, muddy blanket. His eyes were wide, not with curiosity, but with fear. And then the older one moved. She stood up fast, wobbling a little on unsteady legs. Her clothes were damp, her hair tangled. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. And before he could say a word, before he could even take another step, she dropped to her knees right there on the wet ground. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking like dry leaves. "Don't hurt us." Her hands were up, palms out, trembling, not in anger, in surrender. He stopped dead. No one had ever looked at him like that, not with real fear, not like he was something dangerous. He was used to respect, to nods and handshakes and people leaning in when he spoke. But this cut through everything. It wasn't about money or power. It was raw, human, and it hit him like a punch to the chest. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. She didn't move, just stared, eyes searching his face like she was trying to read a language she'd never learned. He took a slow step back, then another. "I was just walking. That's all." The little boy peeked out again, clutching the edge of the blanket like it was the only thing holding him together. The girl glanced at him, then back at the man. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. He didn't know what to do. Call someone? A shelter? The police? But something in her eyes told him that might make things worse. He'd seen enough news stories to know the system didn't always work the way it should, especially for kids who had no one speaking for them. So instead of pulling out his phone, he did something unexpected. He shrugged off his coat, an expensive wool one, dry and warm, and held it out. "Here, you're freezing." She didn't reach for it right away. She looked at the coat, then at him, suspicion warring with exhaustion. Finally, she nodded once and took it, wrapping it around both herself and the little boy like a shield. He crouched down a few feet away, careful not to crowd them. "How long have you been out here?" "Since yesterday," she said quietly. We couldn't go back." He didn't ask why, not yet. Some questions needed time. "Are you hungry?" She hesitated, then nodded. The boy's stomach growled loud enough for all 3 of them to hear. She gave a tiny, embarrassed smile, just a flicker, but it was real. He stood up slowly. "Wait here. I'll be right back." He walked to the corner store 2 blocks away, the rain now a steady drizzle. He bought sandwiches, juice boxes, a bag of chips, and 2 bottles of water. He thought about blankets, socks, anything warm, but didn't want to be gone too long. When he returned, they were still there, curled together under his coat. He set the food down between them. "Go ahead." They didn't need to be told twice. They ate like they hadn't seen food in days, which, for all he knew, might be true. He watched them not with pity, but with a growing ache in his chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not in this city. Not while people like him signed million-dollar deals and toasted to success. "Do you have somewhere to sleep tonight?" he asked gently. The girl shook her head. "The shelter." They said they might separate us. I can't let that happen." Her voice was small but firm. She wasn't just a kid, she was someone's protector. Someone's whole world. He looked around. The park wasn't safe at night. Too dark, too exposed, and the rain wasn't stopping. Without overthinking it, he said, "There's a motel nearby. Clean, quiet. I'll get you a room." "Just for tonight?" Her eyes widened. "Why would you do that?" He didn't have a perfect answer. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the look in her eyes when she begged him not to hurt them. Or maybe it was the first time in years he'd felt something real, something that wasn't about profit or strategy. "Because no one should have to sleep in the rain," he said simply. She studied him again. Longer this time. Then slowly she nodded. He called a cab. Didn't want to risk walking too far with them in the dark. On the short ride, the boy fell asleep against his sister's shoulder. She held him tight, eyes never leaving the window, as if memorizing every streetlight, every turn. At the motel, he paid in cash. Got them a room with 2 beds. Bought extra towels, soap, toothbrushes from the front desk. Didn't make a show of it. Just handed her the key. "You lock the door behind me," he said. "And if anyone knocks, anyone at all, you don't open it unless it's me, and I'll say, 'It's raining again.' Okay?" She nodded, clutching the key like it was a lifeline. He turned to leave, but she called out softly, "Wait." He turned back. "Thank you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He gave a small nod. "Get some rest." Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. He stood under the motel awning for a long time, staring at the sky. His suit was damp, his shoes ruined, and he had a morning meeting in 6 hours. But for the first time in a long time, none of that mattered, because somewhere behind a thin motel door, 2 kids were finally safe, for tonight at least, and that felt like more than any deal ever had. He didn't know what came next. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't unsee what he'd seen. And he couldn't walk away like it never happened. The city slept on, unaware. But something inside him had already begun to change. Morning came gray and quiet, the kind of dawn that feels like the world is holding its breath. He hadn't slept much, tossed and turned in his own bed, miles away from the motel. But his thoughts kept drifting back to those 2 small figures huddled under a thin blanket. He kept seeing the way the girl's hands shook, not from the cold, but from something deeper. Fear that had settled into her bones. By 7, he was back at the motel, not in a suit this time. Just jeans, a sweater, and a paper bag with warm pastries and fresh fruit. He knocked lightly and said the words he'd promised. "It's raining again." A pause. Then the lock clicked. She opened the door just enough to peek out. Her hair was still tangled, but her eyes were clearer now, less panicked, more watchful. The boy stood behind her, clutching a stuffed animal he hadn't seen last night. It was worn down to the threads, one eye missing, but held like treasure. "Hi," the man said gently. "Brought breakfast." She hesitated, then opened the door wider. He stepped inside, careful not to crowd the small room. The beds were neatly made. She'd tidied up even after everything. That small act spoke volumes. This wasn't just survival. It was dignity, clinging on by its fingertips. They ate in silence at first. The boy devoured a muffin like it might vanish if he didn't finish fast enough. She ate slowly, watching the man between bites as if trying to figure out his angle. "You don't have to keep helping us," she finally said, voice low. "I know," he replied, "but I want to." She looked down at her hands. "People say that. Then they stop." He didn't argue. He'd seen enough of the world to know she was right. Good intentions often faded when they got inconvenient. After breakfast, he sat on the edge of one bed while she stayed near the window, the boy playing quietly on the floor with a toy car someone must have left behind. "Do you have any family? Aunts, uncles? Anyone you can stay with?" She shook her head. "Mom said not to trust strangers, but you didn't hurt us." She said it like it surprised her. "What happened to your mom?"
he asked, keeping his voice soft. She swallowed hard.
"There was a man. He came around a lot, yelling. Then, one night, there was a big fight. I heard glass break. I took my brother and ran. We hid in the alley behind our building. Waited, but she never came out." Her voice didn't crack, but her knuckles turned white where she gripped the windowsill. "We went back the next day," she continued. "The door was open. Everything was messy. Mom wasn't there. Her phone was on the floor, broken." She paused. "I called her work. They said she didn't show up. I didn't know who else to call. He felt a lump form in his throat. She'd been making decisions no child should ever have to make. Why didn't you go to the police? He asked. She gave a small, bitter laugh. Too old for her face. Last time we saw police, they took a neighbor's kids and never gave them back. Mom said the system eats people like us. He didn't argue. He'd read enough reports to know foster care wasn't always safe. And for siblings, often they got split up, sent to different homes, different towns. No wonder she ran, he thought for a long moment. Calling child services felt like the right thing to do, but what if it made things worse? What if they were separated? He couldn't live with that. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. A woman answered on the second ring. "It's me," he said. "I need help." Not the kind that shows up in headlines. The quiet kind. He explained the situation in vague terms, no names, no locations, just enough for her to understand. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Give me 2 hours. I'll find someone who can help without triggering the usual channels." He hung up and turned back to the girl. "I know someone who works with families in tough spots. She's good, really good. She won't take you away from your brother, but she can help find your mom and keep you both safe." The girl studied him again. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" "You don't," he admitted. "But I'm asking you to trust me just a little longer. One more day." She looked at her brother, who was now stacking crackers into a tiny tower. Then she nodded. "Okay." By noon, a woman arrived, mid-50s, calm eyes, wearing a simple coat and carrying a tote bag full of papers and granola bars. She introduced herself as someone who helps families stay together. No title, no badge. Just kindness with experience. She sat with the girl for over an hour, not pushing, just listening. The man waited outside, pacing the parking lot, heart pounding like he was the one being judged. When the woman finally came out, she said, "They're scared, but strong. The girl's been keeping her brother fed, clean, even brushing his teeth with water from a gas station sink. She's been their parent for days." He felt a sharp pang in his chest. "Their mom's name is in the system," the woman added quietly. "Not as missing, but as a Jane Doe admitted to County General 3 nights ago. Head trauma. Unconscious at first. She's awake now." His breath caught. "Is she okay?" "Physically, mostly. Mentally, that'll take time, but she's asking for her kids." Relief washed over him, followed by guilt. All this time, the mother was alive, and these two had been alone, thinking the worst. He went back inside. The girl looked up, eyes wide with hope and fear tangled together. "Your mom's at the hospital," he said gently. "She's going to be okay. And she's asking for you." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't cry. She just stood up, walked over, and hugged him. Quick, tight. Then pulled away like she wasn't sure she was allowed. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, throat too tight to speak. The woman arranged transportation. Discreet, no uniforms, no flashing lights. Just a quiet car ride to the hospital. He went with them, not because he needed to, but because he couldn't bear the thought of them walking into that place alone. At the hospital, the girl held her brother's hand like a lifeline. Nurses gave them warm blankets and juice. A social worker, this one kind, patient, guided them to a private room. And there she was. Pale, bruised, arm in a sling, but awake. The moment she saw them, she broke into tears. "My babies," she sobbed, reaching out. They ran to her, climbing onto the bed, burying their faces in her neck like they'd been lost at sea and finally found shore. He stood in the doorway, watching. No one noticed him, and that was fine. He didn't need thanks. He just needed to know they were safe. Later, the mother asked to speak with him, alone. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were clear. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said. "I know," he replied, "but I'm glad I did." She paused, then said something that would stay with him forever. "I used to walk past your office building every morning on my way to my second job. I'd see people in suits rushing in, talking on phones, never looking down. I always wondered, do they even know we exist? People like us working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on?" He didn't have an answer. "I never blamed them," she went on. "I just wished someone would see us. Not as problems, just as people." He looked at her, at the bandages, the tired lines around her eyes, the fierce love in her voice when she called them my babies. and felt something shift deep inside. "I see you now," he said quietly. She gave a small, tired smile. "That's enough." Back at his apartment that night, the city lights glittered below like scattered stars. He should have felt proud. He'd helped. He'd done the right thing, but instead he felt hollow, because he realized something terrible. He'd lived his whole life in a bubble. A beautiful, comfortable, expensive bubble, where hardship was something he read about, not something he witnessed. He'd donated to charities, sure, signed checks, attended galas, but he'd never seen it. Not really, not until a little girl fell to her knees and begged him not to hurt them. He poured a glass of water, no whiskey tonight, and sat by the window. His phone buzzed with messages about deals, meetings, stock updates. None of it mattered now. What mattered was the image burned into his mind. 2 kids eating sandwiches in the rain, sharing one coat, protecting each other when no one else would. He thought about his own childhood, safe, warm, never wondering where the next meal would come from. He hadn't earned that safety. It had just been given to him, like a gift he never knew he'd received. And now, for the first time, he understood the weight of that gift. He picked up his phone again, but not to check emails. He called his assistant. "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the week," he said, "and find me every nonprofit in the city that helps families stay together, especially those working outside the system. I want to meet them, all of them." Then he opened his laptop and started drafting a new plan, not for a business but for something else, something that might actually matter. Outside, the city hummed on, unaware of the quiet change happening in one man's heart. But change had begun, and it wouldn't stop with a motel room or a hospital visit. It would grow. Because once you truly see someone, you can't unsee them, and once you've seen, you can't look away. The days that followed weren't filled with grand speeches or dramatic rescues. They were quiet, careful, and full of small moments that mattered more than any headline ever could. He visited the hospital again, not as a savior, but as someone who simply wanted to make sure they were okay. The mother was healing slowly, both in body and spirit. She spoke little about the man who'd hurt her, and no one pressed her. Some wounds need silence before they can heal. He brought books for the kids, picture books for the boy, adventure stories for the girl. Nothing fancy, just stories where brave kids faced hard things and still found hope. She read them aloud to her brother every evening, her voice steady now, no longer trembling. One afternoon, while the boy napped in a chair beside the bed, the girl pulled a crumpled photo from her pocket. It was worn at the edges, slightly damp but carefully smoothed out. She handed it to the man without a word. In the photo, the mother stood in a sunlit kitchen, flour on her cheek, laughing as she held up a lopsided cake. The girl and her brother sat at the table covered in frosting, grinning like they'd just won the world. It was an ordinary moment, messy, joyful, real. That was her birthday, the girl said softly. She made the cake herself, said it didn't have to be perfect, just made with love. He looked at the photo, then at the woman in the hospital bed, pale, bruised, but watching her children with eyes full of quiet strength. The contrast was heartbreaking. Not because the joy was gone, but because it had been buried under fear and pain. "She never stopped loving you," he said. "I know," the girl replied, "even when we were scared. I kept telling my brother, Mom's coming back. She always comes back," and she had. Not in a blaze of glory, but in a hospital gown, weak but determined. That was its own kind of courage. He started spending less time in boardrooms and more time listening, really listening, to people who lived lives he'd never imagined. Through the woman who'd helped connect them to the hospital, he met others. A teacher who ran an after-school program in a neighborhood most investors avoided, a retired nurse who checked on elderly neighbors living alone, a young man who'd aged out of foster care and now mentored kids so none of them would feel as lost as he once did. These weren't charity cases. They were people, doing hard, quiet work with no cameras, no applause, and they knew things he didn't. How a $50 grocery gift card could keep a family from choosing between food and medicine. How a safe place to shower could mean the difference between getting a job or not. How just being seen could give someone the strength to keep going. One evening, over coffee in a diner with flickering neon lights, the woman who'd helped him said something that stuck. Most people think helping means fixing. But sometimes it just means standing beside someone while they fix themselves. He turned that over in his mind for days. He'd always believed success was about building something big. Companies, empires, legacies carved in steel and glass. But now he wondered, what if real success was measured in moments like this? A child sleeping safely, a mother holding her kids again, a community that refuses to let its own fall through the cracks. He began redirecting his resources, not with fanfare, but with purpose. He funded a small emergency housing program that kept families together instead of splitting them up. He quietly covered medical copays for single parents recovering from injuries. He didn't put his name on anything, didn't issue press releases. This wasn't about reputation, it was about repair. Back at the hospital, the mother was cleared to leave. But returning to their old apartment wasn't an option. The landlord had changed the locks after the incident, citing safety concerns. She didn't argue. She'd already lost too much to fight over four walls. That's when he stepped in again, but carefully. Through a nonprofit that specialized in transitional housing, he arranged a modest apartment in a safe building, fully furnished, rent covered for 6 months. No strings. No interviews. Just a key and a fresh start. The day they moved in, he didn't show up with a moving truck or a speech. He waited until they were settled, then stopped by with groceries and a potted sunflower, because the girl had once mentioned her mom loved flowers. When she opened the door, her eyes lit up. "You came. Just checking in," he said, handing her the bag. Inside, the apartment was simple but warm. The boy was already claiming the smaller bedroom, arranging his toy cars in neat rows. The mother was hanging curtains, her movement slower than before but steady. She turned to him, eyes glistening. This is more than we ever dreamed of. It's not a gift," he said gently. "It's a chance. That's all anyone really needs." She nodded, understanding. Dignity wasn't in the giving, it was in the way it was offered. Over the next few weeks, he visited less often, not because he cared less, but because they didn't need him as much now. And that was the point. Real help wasn't about creating dependence. It was about giving someone back their footing so they could walk on their own. But one rainy afternoon, the girl asked if he'd come by. When he arrived, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook open. "I'm writing a story," she said. "About us." He sat across from her. "What's it about?" "About how we got lost. And someone helped us find our way back," he smiled. "That's a good story." She looked up, serious. "But I don't want it to be sad. I want it to be about hope." "That's the best kind," he said. She hesitated, then asked, "Do you think people like you, people with lots of money, do you ever feel like you're missing something?" He didn't answer right away. Rain tapped against the window. "Yes," he finally said. "I think I did. For a long time." "What were you missing?" "Connection," he said. "I had everything I thought I wanted. Success, comfort, control. But I didn't have real people in my life. Not the kind who show you who you really are." She tilted her head. "And now?" "Now I'm learning," he said. "Thanks to you." She smiled, a real easy smile this time, and went back to her writing. Later, as he walked home through the drizzle, he thought about how his life had changed. He still had his business, his responsibilities, but his priorities had shifted. He'd started mentoring young entrepreneurs from underfunded schools. He'd restructured part of his company to hire and train people facing barriers to employment. He even began attending community meetings, not as a donor, but as a neighbor. People noticed. Some called him soft. Others said he'd lost his edge. But for the first time, he didn't care what they thought. Because he finally understood something simple but powerful. Wealth isn't just about what you have, it's about what you do with it. One night, he found himself back at the park, the same one where he'd first seen them. The playground had been repainted. New swings. Brighter lights. He'd quietly funded the renovation through a city grant, never mentioning his name. He sat on a bench watching kids laugh and climb. No one knew his story. No one needed to. But as he watched a little girl help her younger brother onto the slide, he felt a quiet peace settle over him. Not the kind that comes from winning, but from belonging. He wasn't just passing through life anymore. He was part of it, and that made all the difference. The world kept turning, full of noise and chaos and pain. But in this small corner of the city, 2 kids were safe, a mother was healing, and a man who once thought he had it all had finally found what truly mattered, not in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in the quiet courage of ordinary people who never stopped loving, even when the world tried to break them. He stood up, hands in his pockets, and walked home. Not alone anymore, even if he was by himself, because now he carried their story with him, and it had changed everything. Weeks passed and life settled into a new rhythm. The apartment became a home, filled with the smell of soup on the stove, the sound of bedtime stories, and the occasional crash of toys tumbling down the hallway. The boy started school, clutching his sister's hand on the first day, then letting go with a brave wave. The girl joined an after-school art program, her drawings full of bright colors and strong lines. No shadows anymore, just light. He visited less often now, but always with purpose. Sometimes it was just to drop off school supplies. Other times he'd sit at their kitchen table, drinking tea while the mother talked about job interviews or how her hands still shook when she heard loud voices. He never offered solutions, just listened. That, he'd learned, was often the greatest gift. Then came the day she asked to meet him, not at the apartment, but at a quiet cafe downtown, far from the noise of the city's rush. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back, eyes clear but tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She'd been working part-time at a community center, helping others who'd been through what she'd survived. "It helps me heal," she said, "to know I'm not just a victim. I'm someone who can help." He admired that. She wasn't waiting to be saved. She was rebuilding, brick by brick. They talked about the kids, about the future, about small hopes like a stable job, a garden on the windowsill, maybe even a cat someday. Then after a long pause, she leaned forward slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about you," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Not in a strange way," she added quickly with a small laugh. "But you could have walked past us that night. Most people would have. You didn't even know us, and yet you stayed." He stirred his coffee, not sure what to say. "I guess I just couldn't unsee what I saw." She nodded slowly. "That's what I keep coming back to. You saw us, not as problems. Not as those poor kids, and you saw us as people." He looked out the window. A delivery driver hurried past, head down against the wind. A woman pushed a stroller with one hand and held a coffee cup with the other. Ordinary lives full of invisible struggles. "I used to think I was doing enough," he said quietly. "Donating money, writing checks, showing up at galas with a name tag. I thought that made me a good person. But it didn't feel like enough," she finished for him. "No," he admitted, "it didn't." She was silent for a moment, then said something that would echo in his mind for a long time. "I used to walk past your office building every morning on my way to my second job. I'd see people in suits rushing in, talking on phones, never looking down. I always wondered, do they even know we exist? People like us working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on." He remembered her saying those words before, back in the hospital. But hearing them again in this calm, ordinary setting hit differently. "I never blamed them," she went on. "I just wished someone would see us. Not as problems, just as people." He met her eyes. "I see you now." She gave a small, tired smile. "That's enough." But as he walked home that afternoon, her words stayed with him, not as comfort, but as a quiet reckoning. Because he realized something deeper. It wasn't just that he hadn't seen people like her before. It was that his whole world had been built to keep him from seeing them. His success hadn't happened in a vacuum. It had been made possible by a system that lifted some while leaving others behind, often silently, invisibly. He'd benefited from clean neighborhoods, safe schools, networks of support. Meanwhile, she'd been fighting just to keep her children fed and safe, all while being told, by looks, by policies, by silence, that her life mattered less. That truth settled in his chest like a stone. He began asking harder questions, not just of the world, but of himself. Had he ever truly questioned why some people had so much while others had so little? Or had he just accepted it as the way things are? He'd prided himself on being self-made, but now he wondered, what if part of being self-made was also being blind? One evening he sat in his office, not the sleek downtown one, but a smaller space he'd started using lately, filled with books on community development and notes from conversations with teachers, nurses, and shelter workers. He opened a drawer and pulled out a photo someone had sent him. The girl, standing in front of her new school, holding a drawing she'd made titled "Our Safe Place." In it, 3 stick figures stood under a rainbow holding hands. Above them, in careful letters, "We are home." He stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his legal team. "I want to restructure the foundation," he said. "Not just give money. I want to fund programs that keep families together, that prevent homelessness before it starts, that train people to lead in their own communities. And I want the people we're helping to have a say in how it's run." There was a pause on the other end. "That's unconventional." "Good," he said. "Maybe it's time for that." The next week he met with leaders from grassroots organizations, people who'd lived the struggles they now work to fix. They didn't want handouts. They wanted partnership, respect, a seat at the table. He listened more than he spoke. And for the first time, he understood that real change didn't come from the top down. It grew from the ground up, rooted in trust. But the biggest shift wasn't in his work. It was in his heart. He started noticing things he'd once ignored. The woman sleeping on a subway grate. The teenager working a night shift after school. The elderly man eating alone at the diner every Tuesday. He didn't always stop to help. Sometimes just seeing them was enough. Acknowledging their existence. Honoring their dignity. One rainy evening, he passed a bus stop where a young mother stood with a baby in a carrier, soaked and shivering. Without thinking, he offered his umbrella. She hesitated, then accepted with a quiet thank you. As he walked away, he realized he hadn't done it out of pity. He'd done it because she was a person, just like him, just like the mother he now knew, just like anyone. That was the heartbreak that changed everything. Not the sadness of their suffering, but the realization that he'd lived so long without truly seeing it, and that his comfort had come in part from that blindness. But heartbreak, he was learning, wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something deeper. Compassion, responsibility, connection. He didn't become a saint overnight. He still made mistakes, still had moments of doubt. But he kept showing up, not as a hero, but as a human being trying to do better. Back at the apartment, the family was thriving. The mother had landed a full-time job with benefits. The girl's teacher said she was one of the most thoughtful students she'd ever had. The boy had made a friend who lived down the hall. They raced toy cars every afternoon. He visited one Sunday, bringing ingredients for pancakes. The kids helped mix the batter, flour dusting their noses. The mother laughed, a real, easy laugh that filled the room like sunlight. As they ate at the small table, the girl looked at him and said, "You're part of our story now, you know." He smiled. "I'm honored." Later, as he walked home, the city felt different. Not because it had changed, but because he had. He no longer saw just buildings and streets. He saw lives, struggles, hopes, and in every face he saw a reminder. We're all connected. And the moment we forget that is the moment we lose our humanity. That night, he didn't check his stock portfolio. He wrote a letter, to the girl, to her brother, to their mother, thanking them. Not for letting him help, but for opening his eyes. Because what he'd learned next hadn't just broken his heart. It had remade it. Time has a way of smoothing rough edges. What once felt like a crisis slowly became just another chapter in a much longer story, one still being written, day by day. The apartment that had once been a temporary refuge was now undeniably home. Photos covered the fridge, the boy grinning with missing front teeth. The girl holding up a painting she'd made in art class, their mother standing tall at her workplace holiday party, shoulders back, smile genuine. He still visited, but not out of obligation. More like a quiet habit, like checking in on old friends. Sometimes he'd bring books. Other times he'd just sit on their worn-out couch sipping tea while the kids argued over whose turn it was to feed the goldfish they'd named Sunny. No one treated him like a hero. And that was exactly how it should be. One Saturday morning, months after that rainy night in the park, he found himself walking back to that same playground. The city had fixed the slide, repainted the benches, even added soft rubber under the swings so falls wouldn't hurt as much. He didn't take credit for it, though part of the funding had quietly come from him. But he allowed himself a small smile. Change didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. He sat on a bench near the edge, watching, and then he saw them. The girl pushed her brother on the swing, laughing as he squealed with delight. She'd grown a little taller, her hair neatly braided, her steps sure. The boy's legs kicked wildly, arms outstretched like he was flying. Their mother stood nearby, arms crossed, smiling the kind of smile that comes after you've walked through fire and come out the other side. They hadn't seen him yet. He didn't call out. Didn't wave. Just watched, letting the moment be theirs. A few minutes later, the girl glanced over and her face lit up. She said something to her brother, then walked over, hands in her jacket pockets. "You're back," she said. "Couldn't stay away," he replied. She sat beside him, quiet for a moment. Then, "We're moving soon." He turned. "Moving?" "Not far," she said quickly. "Just to a bigger place. Mom got a promotion. We can afford 2 bedrooms now." She grinned. "I get my own room." "That's wonderful," he said, and he meant it. She looked at the swings. "I'll miss this park." "You'll find another one," he said gently. "Maybe even better." She nodded, then turned to him. "Do you ever think about that night?" "All the time," he admitted. "Me too," she said. "But not in a sad way anymore, more like, it's the night everything changed. For all of us," he added. She smiled, then stood up. "Want to see something?" He followed her to the far side of the playground where a new community garden had sprouted. Rows of tomatoes, sunflowers, herbs in neat boxes. In one corner, a small wooden sign read, "Planted by local families." "Watered with hope. My mom helped start this," she said proudly. "She says if you grow something together, you remember you're not alone." He ran his fingers over the edge of the sign. Simple words. Powerful truth. Later, as they walked back toward the swings, the boy ran up and tugged his sleeve. "Look what I can do." He scrambled onto the monkey bars and crossed them. Slowly, carefully, but all the way across. When he dropped down, he beamed. "That was amazing," the man said. The boy nodded seriously. "I practiced every day. That was the thing about healing. It wasn't magic. It was practice. Showing up. Trying again." Back at the bench, the mother joined them. She looked healthier, stronger, her eyes calm in a way they hadn't been before. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wouldn't miss it." They talked about small things, the boy's love of dinosaurs, the girl's dream of becoming a teacher, the neighbor's cat that kept stealing their socks. Normal life. Precious life. Before he left, the girl handed him a folded piece of paper. "For you." He opened it later back in his car. It was a drawing, simple but full of heart. A man in a coat standing under a street lamp. 2 small figures reaching toward him. Above them, in careful handwriting, "You saw us when no one else did." He folded it carefully and tucked it into his wallet. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. In the months that followed, his life continued to shift, not in dramatic leaps, but in steady steps. He stepped down from a few high-profile boards, not out of disinterest, but because he wanted to focus on work that mattered more deeply. He poured energy into the foundation he'd rebuilt from the ground up, now run in partnership with people who'd once needed its help. They decided together where funds went. Emergency housing that kept siblings together, job training for survivors of violence, mental health support in schools. He stopped giving interviews about philanthropy. Instead, he listened more, spoke less, and let others tell their own stories. One afternoon, he received a call from a young woman who'd aged out of foster care years ago. She now ran a mentorship program for teens in similar situations. "We've got a new space," she said. "Thanks to your support. We're calling it The Next Step." He visited the next week. Bright walls, cozy couches, a kitchen where kids could learn to cook. One teen shyly showed him a poem she'd written about finding her voice. He didn't offer advice, just said, "Keep writing." That was the lesson he kept learning. Help isn't about fixing. It's about believing in someone enough to let them rise on their own. Years passed. The boy started middle school. The girl graduated high school with honors and enrolled in college to study education. Their mother became a peer counselor, helping other survivors navigate the system that had once failed them. She never forgot what it felt like to be invisible, and made sure no one in her care ever felt that way. And him? He never became famous for any of it. No headlines, no awards, and that was fine. The real reward wasn't recognition, it was peace. The kind that comes when your actions finally match your values. One spring evening, long after the story had faded from urgency into memory, he returned to the park again. The swings creaked softly in the breeze. A few kids played nearby, their laughter floating through the air like music. He sat on the same bench. Watched the sunset paint the sky in gold and pink. No grand thoughts, no heavy regrets, just quiet gratitude. Because he'd learned something simple but life-changing. We don't need to save the whole world to make a difference. Sometimes saving one moment, one child, one family, one heart is enough. And in that moment, as the city hummed around him, he knew he'd been saved too. Not from anything dramatic, but from a life lived behind glass, watching the world through a window, never truly touching it. Now, he was part of it. Messy, beautiful, imperfect, and real. He stood up, brushed off his coat, and walked home, not as a millionaire who once did a good deed, but as a man who finally understood what it meant to be human. And somewhere in a home filled with light and laughter, two kids grew up knowing they mattered. That was the real legacy, not in buildings or bank accounts, but in lives changed, quietly, kindly, and forever.